G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Meter here. We're back, and boy do we have a lot to show for the time that I've been away. At the end of the last video going over the science of the orbital strike cannon, which you should definitely watch to get the context of what we're doing in this video, I introduced the concept of the instant perimeter cannon. A TNT cannon that can warp TNT into unloaded chunks and blast out a perimeter anywhere in your world. Well, we've run into a bit of a hitch. Here comes the payload, ready to fire, and... oh god. Yeah, it turns out if you try to squeeze all the operations that go into making a perimeter into a single TNT cannon, you run into some pretty stiff hardware limitations. To fix this, we can reduce the scope of our problem to a more basic application of this tech. So I decided to start simple with a tunnel bore. But this is no ordinary tunnel bore. This is the Infinibore. Conventionally, tunnel bores are huge flying machines that need extreme tender love and care to, well, not blow up all the time. This is especially a problem in the Nether, where dealing with lava is literally hell. Like, seriously, it is literally impossible to run a tunnel bore beneath a lava lake. Come on Mojang, freaking lava sponges already. But here's the kicker. Using TNT warping technology, we can make a cannon that literally does not give a rotating rat's ass about fluids. And because the cannon doesn't move, we can program it to simply run forever, gradually incrementing the TNT further and further and further off into infinity. In fact, with this hex-encoded incrementing circuit, we can theoretically run the bore for 500,000 blocks. And that is only being limited by the hex encoder's memory, so we can expand it even further. But to be perfectly honest, I think 500,000 is a good place to call it. So how do you use the Infinibore? Well, let's start with some example terrain that we want to yeet out of existence and grab ourselves a schematic of the Infinibore. Something to keep in mind about the Infinibore is that it's extremely sensitive to its chunk alignment. So we want to go ahead into all the various placements, disable all of these except for the clearance and the chunk align. We want to line up our clearance with the section of the terrain that we want to remove. There we go. So this is where we'll be removing blocks, approximately. We also want to make sure that the chunk alignment indicator is correctly aligned so that the red square is fully contained within a chunk and the green square is fully contained within a chunk. So the green chunks essentially will be the entity processing chunks. The red chunks will be the redstone processing chunks where we can do the lazy acceleration and store our TNT indefinitely in stasis. However, there is an additional level of chunk loading, another chunk out, which is known as the border chunks. And the problem is, the border chunks, while they can't process any entities and they effectively behave like the lazy chunks, entities within these chunks can still collide with blocks, which is the reason why we need to have this additional clearance and extra chunk out from the redstone processing chunks to ensure that our TNT doesn't collide with any blocks within the border chunks. However, the moment that we get outside of the border chunks, It is open season and our TNT can warp indefinitely without colliding with anything. So now that our chunk alignment is done, we can go back into the schematic, disable the chunk align, and activate the subregion known as separator. The separator is a very interesting mechanism because it provides a very simple way to expand the width of the tunnel bore. The basic principle is that we can take a batch of TNT, which all has pre-programmed velocities, and then swipe it across this entity separator, which will release the TNT one at a time. And unfortunately, due to issues with rendering entities in lazy chunks, this is actually very difficult to visualize. But I hope you can get the basic idea. And there's heaps of cool tricks you can do, such as giving the TNT downwards velocity, so that when we release it in the machine, we can actually release the TNT at different heights. And to expand the width of your ball, all you really need to do is take a slice of the entity separator and then stack it sideways. You can also control the spacing between TNT in the horizontal direction by simply stacking it once, removing one of the separator modules, like so, expanding the selection, and stacking it half as much. Just make sure to always include the system for turning around the conveyor on the end. And now you can go ahead and build the rest of the cannon. If you go up to the control platform, you'll be confronted with a whole bunch of different settings, such as the payload count, the cavitation spacing, operational spacing, operation runtime, an on-off switch for when you actually want to run the system, an incremental reset for the hex encoded memory, and on the bottom floor you'll find a payload count multiplier as well as a cavitation layer counter. To understand how to use these settings to optimize the tunnel bore for all different types of terrain, we need to understand a bit more about how the machine actually works. To maximize the efficiency of our cannon, we'll want to divide the area into a grid. The horizontal direction is controlled using our separators, but then the forward direction is controlled using TNT as a propellant. A payload is created with a specific amount of TNT defined by the payload count times the payload count multiplier. The payload is then spread out over the horizontal direction. The cavitation spacing offsets each payload in the forward direction using TNT as a propellant. This of course uses lazy acceleration to keep the payload in stasis as the propellant is applied. Cavitation layer counter then repeats each payload up to a certain limit, as trying to process a batch with too much TNT all at once in the separator creates enormous amounts of lag. Thus, to improve performance, we separate the operation of the tunnel bore into multiple batches defined by the operational spacing. And finally, the operation runtime will tell the tunnel bore how many times to repeat an operation automatically, because once the machine is started, the player can't actually get anywhere near it in order to sustain the payload in lazy chunks. With some understanding of the core functionality under our belts, let's go ahead and set this machine up to create a cavity underneath this massive block of terrain. Let's start with the payload count. This right here is a slime bar conveyor design that I took from Bavella. What it will do is pick up our payload and start scanning forwards. If I select the entity separator with Lightmatica, we can go ahead and have a look at the material list by analyzing the area. You can see that we have exactly 64 fence gates. So whatever we decide for the payload count, it will need to be a multiple of 64. Something else we need to consider for the payload count is how many times we want the TNT to explode in each location. Because if we simply warp the TNT into a bunch of stone and have it explode there, the TNT will only destroy one of the blocks. And so we will need at least 2 TNT to go into the stone to make an impact. But even this is not very effective. So let's go all the way up to 3 TNT and now you can see we start making a dent. You should also keep in mind that this varies enormously, as lower blast resistant blocks like netherrack, you can see, have very little impact on the blast radius of the TNT, meaning you don't need as much TNT as densely packed in order to bite through netherrack. I find that the most versatile amount of TNT to have at each location is 3. And then finally, we need to consider that we separate the TNT between one layer at the top here, and then another layer of TNT offset in the Y direction. So what we get is 64 different points where we separate the TNT, multiplied by 3 TNT that we want in each location, multiplied by 2 different layers in the Y direction, gives us a total of 384 TNT per payload. The payload count can't actually get all the way to 384. So instead, we'll divide it by 2 to get 192, minus 176, leaves behind 16. That is 16 plus 176 equals 192. And then if we go down here and multiply that by 2, we get 384. Now we get to the cavitation spacing. Once again, this depends heavily on the blast resistance of the material. This was roughly a 5.5 block spacing, and as you could see, 3 charges was able to sort of connect the 2 cells together. With a much weaker material such as netherrack, however, we can get away with a much larger cavitation spacing in order to increase our TNT efficiency. Given that the bulk of the material in this particular example is deep slate, which has the same blast resistance as stone, we'll be setting the cavitation spacing to 6. The operation spacing, as well as the cavitation layer counter, are fundamentally connected. For each count of the cavitation layer counter, we will obtain an offset of roughly 6 TNT's worth of acceleration. And each TNT's worth of acceleration is roughly 0.93 blocks. If we go ahead and measure our example area, we find that it's 192 blocks long. 192 divided by 0.93 times 6 gives us about 35 cavitation layers. But if we try to do 35 cavitation layers at once with 384 TNT per cavitation layer, that means that in total we'll have about 13,000 TNT being processed at the same time by our entity separator. If we want to improve the lag performance of our tunnel bore, we can go ahead and halve the cavitation layers, and then take the 17 remaining cavitation layers, multiply that by the 6 cavitation spacing to get an operational spacing of 102. Let's bring this up to the closest value that's less than 102, which is 88. And then we can add on the fine adjustment as 14. 88 plus 14 gives us 102. And now instead of doing the entire area in one big laggy operation, we can now divide it into 2 more lag efficient operations. Now, before we can go and prime the tunnel bore, what we need to figure out is how to chunk load the machine. In order to very carefully control the chunk loading for the orbital strike cannon, we use portal-based chunk loaders to obtain the entity as well as the redstone chunk loading regions. However, for the Infinibore, you'll need to provide an entire line of redstone processing chunks on this side of the machine, as well as an entire line of entity processing chunks on this side of the machine. And that could be an enormous pain in the butt to make that many portal-based chunk loaders. And so instead, what we can do is use the chunk loading distance of the player. So if we move away from the machine like so, we can see the edge of our render distance. If we keep going back until, there we go, the moment that we can no longer see the red square, but can still see the green square, that is the perfect position for the player to be. So of course, something to keep in mind is this is highly dependent on the player's render distance. So I go ahead and increase my render distance like so. Now I have to move backwards a bit more with the longer render distance. And there we go. That is the distance we need to stand for a render distance of 16. Alright, now that we've established where the player needs to stand in order to chunk load the machine, we can go ahead and hit the on button. So once we press this button, the machine will be primed. However, this safety switch won't actually start the machine until the player is out of range. It is imperative that you do not go anywhere near this machine while it's running. If you happen to load the machine while there is a payload suspended in the lazy chunks, well, that payload's obviously just going to instantly detonate. However, if this does happen, the damage is pretty easy to repair. Let's go into Spectator, where Spectator is generating chunks false, and watch the machine start running. There we go. It's preparing the first payload. So that is the 2 multiples of 192, and then that is the offset charge. There we go, that's the final propellant charge. Then it gets loaded into the slime bar, and now it starts getting distributed by the fence gates. So the fence gates act as an entity separator where a single TNT gets taken out of the batch, then pushed over into the anti-processing chunks, where it immediately zips down and collides with one of these 2 blocks, before flying off and warping into the terrain. With each batch containing 17 layers, each containing 384 TNT per layer, and the conveyor taking 12 game ticks to release each TNT, each operation will take roughly 65 minutes. If we take a look at the MSPT, you can see why we need to try and limit the amount of TNT in each batch. The entity separation process is quite resource intensive, and I demonstrated this at the start of the video with the instant perimeter cannon. What I find interesting is that because the lag is directly proportional to the amount of TNT, you can actually see the progress of the tunnel bore represented by the MSPT. And if you're tick warping, this means the machine gets faster as the batch gets depleted. So, are there any advantages to making the batch larger? Well, not really. The bottleneck is still how quickly we can release the TNT, and the machine can prepare another batch while the entity separator is running. And the cannon will probably need to fire an extremely long distance before the charging time exceeds the separation time. So why not make it as fast as humanly possible by just releasing all the TNT at once? Well, whenever the TNT warps into an unloaded chunk, it will briefly load that chunk as a border chunk, causing other TNT launched in the same tick to collide with that chunk. So if you release all the TNT at once, you can only get a single TNT into each chunk, meaning you would need to fire separate batches, which defeats the purpose of firing all at once anyway. Plus, it will be super laggy. At least with this slow, methodical approach of releasing the TNT one by one, we can achieve the best compromise of lag efficiency and speed. Alright, the tunnel bore is finally done, which means now we get to experience what I think is the most satisfying aspect of this design. Because the TNT only loads the chunks as border chunks when it explodes, the item entities are completely unaffected. If I go ahead and load the entire area, all of the items appear instantly. If only there was a mob that could help you pick up all of these items. Well, would you look at that? It turns out allays are useful for something after all. Although to be perfectly honest, your frame rates are definitely not going to enjoy this. And just like that, we've run out of time. But these guys synergize surprisingly well with the tunnel bore when used in the overworld. Just look at how many diamonds we got from that. And in the nether, what you get is the ultimate nether debris mining machine. Because we can just completely ignore all of the lava and get directly to all the ancient debris. However, you probably want to bring along a couple of potions of fire resistance. However, we may need a better solution for getting at ancient debris underneath lava lakes. For example, I'm using a mod that grants me full visibility under lava. But what is interesting is that because ancient debris is fireproof, you can just mine it under the lava and not have to worry about the items getting burned. But I'm sure somebody who's a god at Slimestone could come up with a brilliant solution for the lava situation. So that is the Infinibore, Minecraft's ultimate mining machine. This is only the simplest application I could see for this TNT warping technology. So there'll be a lot more to come. After all, we already have a working template for the instant perimeter cannon. It'll just take some time to figure out how to implement the solutions that I found for the Infinibore to a 2-axis design that can fire anywhere in your world. So in the meantime, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.